Carbon border rules are repricing cross-border trade. Carbon border mechanisms have crossed a threshold. What began as climate policy designed to prevent carbon leakage is now altering how companies price imports, structure supplier agreements, and model trade exposure. For procurement and finance leaders, the shift is practical. Embedded emissions are becoming a cost variable. The EU's model moves from reporting to financial exposure. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, administered by the European Commission, entered its transitional reporting phase in October 2023. Importers of cement, aluminum, fertilizers, iron and steel, hydrogen and electricity must report embedded emissions through the end of 2025. Beginning January 1st, 2026, the system moves into its definitive phase. Importers will be required to purchase CBAM certificates reflecting the carbon intensity of their goods, linked to the EU Emissions Trading System, EU ETS, carbon price. The first meaningful certificate surrender tied to 2026 imports will occur in 2027. This is where theory becomes arithmetic. 2 shipments of steel at identical base prices can now land at different effective costs, depending on verified embedded emissions data, the applicable EU carbon price, whether default emissions factors apply. In other words, carbon intensity is becoming part of landed cost. Emissions trading systems are multiplying the effect. CBAM is the most visible border model, but it sits within a broader global landscape. According to ICAP's 2025 status report, 38 emissions trading systems are now in operation worldwide, covering major economies across Europe, Asia, and North America. The EU ETS remains the largest and most mature, but other systems are shaping upstream production economics. The United Kingdom operates its own post-Brexit ETS. China's national ETS, initially focused on power generation, is expanding into cement, steel, and aluminum. Subnational systems, including California's cap-and-trade program, influence regional production costs. Even where a formal border mechanism does not yet exist, producers in carbon price jurisdictions embed compliance costs into commodity pricing. For multinational buyers, this creates uneven cost structures across suppliers before a border levy is ever applied. Carbon taxes and hybrid models add predictability, not simplicity. Not all carbon pricing is market-based. Carbon taxes and hybrid systems introduce scheduled per-ton charges that escalate over time. These structures can appear more predictable than cap-and-trade programs. But from a contract perspective, they raise similar questions. Are carbon costs treated as pass-through expenses? Is price adjustment automatic or discretionary? How are regulatory expansions handled midterm? Long-term sourcing agreements signed without carbon adjustment language are increasingly vulnerable to mispricing. The contract is becoming the carbon battlefield. Across sectors such as steel, aluminum, and cement, contract clauses are evolving quickly. Procurement and legal teams are incorporating explicit carbon cost allocation provisions, change in law clauses addressing scope expansion, audit rights tied to embedded emissions verification, default emissions remedies if supplier data proves inaccurate. Carbon intensity is beginning to resemble credit risk or quality assurance, measurable, negotiable, and enforceable. The operational pressure is real. If embedded emissions data cannot be verified, default values may apply. Those defaults can increase exposure relative to actual performance. Suppliers that invest in credible product-level carbon accounting are gaining leverage, those that do not risk cost assumptions being imposed on them. Trade is entering a carbon-adjusted cost era. Carbon border rules were framed as environmental safeguards. In practice, they are becoming trade instruments. The implications extend beyond Europe. Policymakers in other jurisdictions continue to evaluate border adjustments or sector-specific protections. Even without formal adoption elsewhere, the EU's enforcement model is influencing global exporters that rely on European markets. For executive leadership, the exposure is no longer abstract. Carbon price volatility now affects margin assumptions. Supplier selection increasingly includes emissions performance. Multi-year capital planning must account for regulatory expansion risk. This is not yet a uniform global carbon tariff, but it is a structural repricing of emissions-intensive trade. Carbon has moved from disclosure to liability, and in cross-border contracts, liability becomes math. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.